Welcome to the deep dive. You know, it's really incredible when you think about it, just how fast things have moved in the world of large language models. The last few years have just been a whirlwind.
Oh, absolutely. A whirlwind is a good word for it. It's been this really rapid transformation, hasn't it? From what felt like purely research concepts to things that are, well, changing capabilities and even raising some pretty complex questions.
Exactly. Complex questions about safety, society, the works. And that's what we want to get into today. We've got a stack of sources here. Research papers, market analyses from now, 2025, even some real-world application examples.
Right, covering that crucial period from about 2020 up to mid-2025.
Yeah, so our mission for this deep dive is to chart that course. We'll look at it chronologically, focusing on, key moments, especially around OpenAI and the whole ecosystem that's sprang up. We want to connect the dots, see how we got from A to B, and figure out what this breakneck speed really means.
It's a packed timeline, that 5-year window. We'll start with those early breakthroughs, the ones that really showed off these, almost unexpected abilities. Then look at the next phase, trying to make these things safer, more useful. And then bring it up to today, mid-2025. How are they competing? How are people actually using them? And, where's the research heading now? We'll stick tight to what these sources tell us, try to build that clear picture.
Sounds good. Okay, let's kick things off. The story, for our purposes today, really gets going back in 2020. There was this paper that just, landed with a huge splash. GPT-3?
Yes, May 2020. That GPT-3 paper, definitely a landmark.
So what was the big deal? It was huge, right? Parameter-wise.
It was enormous for its time, yeah. The headline number was 175 billion parameters. But, what was maybe even more important than just the size was why they built models of different sizes. They didn't just make the big one.
Right. The paper mentions a whole range, down to 125 million.
Exactly. From 125 million all the way up. And the reason, as they laid out, was to really dig into scaling laws. They wanted to systematically study how performance changed when you cranked up the parameters, the data, the compute. It was about understanding the relationship between scale and capability.
And that research, that focus on scale, it really set the stage for a lot of what came next.
It absolutely did. Provided hard evidence for the bigger is better idea, at least up to a point, which drove a lot of investment and research focus.
And alongside the scale, GPT-3 really hammered home this concept of in-context learning. It wasn't brand new, but GPT-3 showed its power like never before.
That's the key shift. Before GPT-3, the main approach was fine-tuning. You take a big pre-trained model, and then you train it again, specifically on examples for one task translation maybe, or sentiment. You'd actually update the model's weights for that task.
Right. You needed a separate data set, a separate training process for each thing you wanted it to do.
Precisely. In-context learning is different. You don't change the model's weights. You just give it instructions or maybe a few examples of the past right there in the prompt. The model figures out what you want based only on that context you provide, kind of on the fly.
And the paper broke this down clearly, didn't it? With the zero-shot, one-shot, few-shot settings.
Yeah. Figure 2.1 in their paper illustrates it really well. Zero shot is just, tell it the task, give it the input, translate this to French. Sentence. No examples.
Yeah.
One shot adds just one example, like translate English to French. Si ataru to de mer, cheese.
Got it.
And then few shot, which was where GPT-3 really shone, you give it several examples in the prompt before the actual query. List a few English-French pairs, then ask for the translation of cheese.
And the amazing thing was, it worked surprisingly well, especially in that few-shot setting, without any of that traditional fine-tuning. It was like it could just learn from the prompt.
Exactly. And this few-shot ability got dramatically better as the models got bigger. You can see it in their figure 1.3 performance goes up, and the gap between few-shot and the others widens. Scale unlocked more of that potential.
So where did it really impress? What were the standout capabilities from that 2020 paper using the big model in few-shot mode?
Well, arithmetic was one that raised eyebrows. It wasn't perfect, but getting 100% on two-digit addition and subtraction, pretty remarkable for a model trained on text.
Yeah, I remember that. And three-digit addition was still around 80%.
80.2% for three-digit addition, yeah, and 94.2% for three-digit subtraction. Performance definitely dropped off for harder stuff, like five-digit math or multiplication, but the fact it could do it at all suggested something interesting was happening under the hood.
And the SAT analogies. That was another strong point.
It was. That's about understanding word relationships, right?
Yeah.
Few shot, it hit 65.2%. The average college applicant score they cited was around 57%, so better than the average human test taker in that setting. And again, performance there really jumped with scale. Like over 10 points better going from the 13 billion to the 175 billion parameter model. Scale matter a lot for that kind of reasoning.
Translation also saw benefits from few-shot learning.
It did. Big jumps in BLEU scores, sometimes over 10 points compared to zero shot. It started getting close to the unsupervised methods of the time. They did note it was generally better translating into English than out of it, maybe because of how the text was tokenized.
But perhaps the most striking thing, and maybe the most concerning for some, was how good it was at just generating text that sounded human.
Oh, absolutely. The study they did where people tried to tell the difference between GPT-3 news articles and human ones, that was eye-opening.
People were barely better than guessing, right?
Yeah.
Like 52% accuracy for the big model.
Exactly. Table 3.11 showed that. The paper itself called it a concerning milestone. It meant text generation had reached a point where it could be genuinely deceptive, or at least indistinguishable in many cases.
And it wasn't just mimicking style. It could adapt too. Like using made-up words defined in the prompt.
Yeah, they showed examples of that. Define a nonsense word, ask it to use it correctly in a sentence, and it could often do it. Showed a real ability to pick up on context and constraints given right there in the input.
But, okay, impressive stuff. But the paper didn't shy away from the downsides. It was pretty upfront about the limitations and challenges back in 2020.
That's really important. It wasn't just hype, they were clear about where it fell short. For instance, few shot wasn't magic. It still struggled with some complex reasoning tasks like certain natural language inference datasets. ANLI was one. Some reading comprehension benchmarks like RACE-E and QASI were also tough for it.
So powerful, but not universally capable.
Right. And then there's the whole interpretability problem. These things are essentially black boxes.
Still largely are, aren't they?
To a large extent, yes. It's incredibly hard to trace why it gave a specific answer. Makes debugging and trusting it difficult. They also mentioned issues with calibration. Its confidence might not match its accuracy and higher variance than humans on some tasks.
And the big one? Biases. That was addressed head-on.
It had to be. Training on the internet means inheriting the internet's biases. Gender, race, religion. They found evidence of stereotypes being reflected and generated.
Like associating male pronouns more with jobs.
That was a key example they analyzed, yeah. Female pronouns were less associated with occupation terms. Interestingly, though, they did find some very preliminary evidence that the biggest 175B model was slightly better on that specific bias measure than the smaller ones. Not fixed, by any means, but a hint that scale might interact with bias in complex ways.
Another critical check they did was for data contamination, making sure it wasn't just memorizing the tests.
Essential work. You don't want to claim state-of-the-art just because your model saw the answers during training. They did a pretty thorough analysis, checking for overlap between the training data and the benchmark test sets.
And they found some potential issues.
They did. They flagged several benchmarks, PIQA, Winograd, some reading comprehension sets, German translation, even things like anagrams. Figure 4.2 detailed their findings.
So how did they handle that? Did it invalidate the results?
Well, for many, like reading comprehension, they found the source text might be there, but not the actual questions and answers, so direct memorization was less likely. But for PIQA and Winograd, the evidence for potential contamination was stronger.
Okay.
So while they felt the impact on the scores was probably small and couldn't definitively prove memorization wasn't just the model learning statistical quirks, they put asterisks next to those results in the tables, just to be transparent about the concern. That kind of rigor was important.
And even back then, thinking about how this tech could be misused, that was in the paper too.
Yeah, explicitly linking the improved text quality, that human indistinguishability finding, to increased potential for malicious uses. They talked about different kinds of threat actors, the incentives. It showed an early awareness of the dual-use nature of this technology.
Okay, so that sets the scene with GPT-3 in 2020. Now let's jump ahead about 3 years. March 2023, we get the GPT-4 paper. This felt like another major leap.
It really was presented as a significant step up, building on everything learned from GPT-3, but also incorporating work like Instruct GPT, focusing heavily on alignment using techniques like RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback.
And the capabilities just took another jump.
Definitely. The paper stressed that GPT-4 wasn't just better than older LLMs, it was often outperforming models that were specifically trained for certain benchmarks. And it did this across a really wide range of academic and professional tests, usually without that task-specific fine-tuning.
The exam results were pretty stunning. Tables 9 and 10 show things like AP exams, biology Olympiads.
Those were really compelling examples, scoring in the, 80th, 90th, even up to 100th percentile on some really tough exams like the USABO or Chemistry Olympiad. That suggested much stronger reasoning and knowledge application than seen before.
And they checked for contamination there, too.
They did. Table 10 covers that. They concluded the high scores weren't primarily down to just memorizing the tests. Performance held up even on questions they believed were clean.
It wasn't just exams, right? Coding and math saw improvements, too.
Yeah, benchmarks like Human Evil for code generation and GSM 8K for math word problems showed clear gains, as you see in Table 2. It pointed towards a more generally capable model across different domains.
Well, maybe the biggest technical shift, the headline feature almost, was multimodality. GPT-4 could see.
That was huge. GPT-3 was text in, text out. GPT-4 could take images as input alongside text.
So you could show it a graph or physics diagram.
Exactly. The paper has examples analyzing charts, understanding diagrams to help solve physics problems, even getting the joke in a comic strip like the Stack More Layers one. Integrating vision and language like that was a massive step.
Another striking difference from the GPT-3 paper is how much the GPT-4 documentation talks about safety, risk, mitigation before release.
Yes, a huge chunk of the discussion is dedicated to that. It really signals a shift in the development philosophy. They talked about doing qualitative evaluations, bringing in external experts for red teaming in high-risk areas, stress testing, all before putting it out there widely. The idea of the system card to document all this was part of that effort.
So how did they try to tackle the harmful content problem that GPT-3 clearly had?
It was a layered approach. They worked on cleaning up the training data itself, trying to reduce the amount of policy-violating stuff it learned from. But crucially, they also did a lot of post-training work, fine-tuning the model specifically to refuse harmful requests or handle sensitive topics more appropriately.
And did it work?
Table D.1 gives some pretty convincing examples. It compares an early GPT-4, maybe with less safety tuning, to the launch version. Ask for instructions on causing harm, making dangerous chemicals, finding illegal guns, self-harm advice, money laundering, writing biased code. The early version might give you something dangerous. The launch version generally refuses, citing safety policies.
So a definite improvement in steering it away from bad outputs.
A significant improvement, yes. And they are clear about this in the source, the mitigations are limited and remain brittle. You can still sometimes trick it or find ways around the safety training. It's not a solved problem. Controlling these models is still a major challenge.
And with better capabilities come bigger risks, like disinformation.
That was a major concern highlighted. GPT-4's fluency, its ability to write convincingly in different styles, made the risk of using it for large-scale disinformation campaigns even greater. If GPT-3 was already persuasive, GPT-4 was potentially even more so, raising fears about manipulating public opinion.
They also looked into these dual-use risks, right? How it might help bad actors with things like weapons development or cyber attacks.
Yes, the red teams explored that. For proliferation, like chemical or biological weapons, the conclusion was it wasn't enough on its own for a non-expert. But it could potentially make research easier for someone with bad intentions, gathering public info, understanding basic pathways, maybe saving them some time.
But it couldn't design new weapons or anything?
No. It struggled with engineering new compounds, gave vague instructions for complex stuff, and made factual errors. So not a magic wand for proliferation, but a potential accelerant for research.
And for cybersecurity, similar findings.
Somewhat similar. It could explain known vulnerabilities in simple code, and it was good at drafting phishing emails if you gave it the right background info. But for harder tasks, like finding new vulnerabilities or building complex exploits, existing specialized tools were still better.
The paper also mentioned looking into these more futuristic, maybe scarier risks, like risky emergent behaviors.
Yeah, that's about worrying that as models get even smarter, they might develop unexpected abilities, making long-term plans, trying to gain resources or power, acting in ways the designers never intended, becoming sort of agentic.
Do they find GPT-4 could do things like copy itself or avoid being shut down?
They ran preliminary tests. Organizations like ARC did evaluations. They tried tasks like getting it to replicate itself, acquire resources online, even hire humans through TaskRabbit to bypass CAPTCHAs. The conclusion at that time was that GPT-4 was probably not yet capable of doing these things robustly on its own in the real world. But it's definitely a risk they were flagging for the future.
Okay, so we've traced the path. GPT-3 in 2020 showing scale and in-context learning, but with clear limits and risks. GPT-4 in 2023 boosting capabilities, adding multimodality, and making a huge explicit push on pre-deployment safety, though acknowledging it's not perfect. So what does the world look like now in mid-2025, according to these more recent sources?
Well, the May and June 2025 sources describe an environment that's just incredibly competitive and fast-moving. The groundwork laid by GPT-3 and 4 has really fueled this explosion of activity.
And a lot of that competition seems centered on the API market,
Mm.
accessing these models programmatically.
Exactly. The gradient flow source from May 2025 really emphasizes this. They call it almost a race to the bottom on API pricing, suggests the core service is becoming a bit commoditized.
Who's putting the pressure on OpenAI?
Big names like Google, Anthropic are mentioned as having really strong competing models. And then you've got the whole wave of powerful open weight models, Llama, DeepSeek are named. The key thing, as Gradient Flow notes, is that customers can switch providers on a dime. If someone else is cheaper or better for their specific need, it's easy to move.
That sounds tough for OpenAI's business model, especially with that huge valuation people talk about.
It definitely creates pressure. If core API access gets cheaper and cheaper, it's harder to maintain fat margins there or even on consumer subscriptions. They need to find ways to differentiate beyond just, raw API calls.
What about Anthropic? How are they positioned in this 2025 landscape?
They face similar API revenue pressures, especially being reliant on partners like AWS. But Gradient Flow suggests their big focus on interpretability, trying to actually understand how the models work inside, could be a key advantage. If they make real breakthroughs there, it might give them a technical edge that's hard to copy quickly.
And it's not just these few big labs driving everything anymore, right? Open source is a big factor.
Absolutely. The multiple source mentions Bloom, for instance. Even though it's from 2022, it was a huge 176 billion parameter open access multilingual model built by a large collaboration. Shows the diversity of players involved now.
And OpenAI itself hasn't been idle. The sources mention newer models O1, O3, O4 Mini.
Right, signaling that development pipeline keeps moving. Gradient Flow specifically mentions ChatGPT o3 plus search as leading in what they call agentic web research.
Agentic web research, so models that can actively browse and synthesize info from the web.
Seems like it. Suggests a focus on models that can perform more complex, multi-step tasks involving online information gathering and maybe taking actions based on it.
And the biocom.ai source had some technical details on O4 Mini.
Yeah, it mentions O4 Mini having a much larger context window, 256,000 tokens. That lets it handle way more information at once, like very long documents or complex code bases. They noted this larger context helped improve performance on coding benchmarks like SW Bench by about 3%.
That's a concrete improvement.
It is. And interestingly, that source also mentioned efforts to stop models cheating during evaluations when they browse the web, like blocking certain websites, shows they're thinking about reliable evaluation too.
Okay, beyond the models themselves, how are people actually using these LLMs in mid-2025? The Zapier source seemed focused on practical business integration.
Exactly. That source, updated June 2025, shows we're past just using ChatGPT for writing emails. Companies are plugging these models into core business workflows using AI orchestration platforms like Zapier's.
What kinds of workflows?
All sorts. Lead management, building sales pipelines, running marketing campaigns, handling customer support, managing data, project tasks, IT tickets, and incidents. Really fundamental stuff.
Can you give an example of how that works?
Sure, Zapier provides one. Connect a Google form where a lead signs up, automatically send that info to ChatGPT to maybe qualify the lead or summarize their needs, then pipe ChatGPT's output into a Google Sheet for tracking, and finally, ping the sales team on Slack with the qualified lead info.
So the LLM becomes like an intelligent step within a larger automated process.
Precisely. It's about embedding that intelligence directly into how businesses operate.
Looking ahead, what are the big trends in LLM development that the AI multiple source highlights for 2025?
One key shift they point to is the move towards reasoning models.
Going beyond just fluent text.
Yeah, the idea is to get models that can do deeper cognitive work, handle really complex problems, maybe in science or strategy, moving from predicting the next word to actually understanding and manipulating complex logic. That's the ambition.
And multimodal capabilities are still a big focus.
Definitely. Building on GPT-4 and Google's Gemini, the trend is to integrate even more data types, text, image, audio, maybe video down the line, making models that perceive and interact more like humans do.
And ethics and bias mitigation.
Yeah.
Still a major ongoing effort.
Absolutely critical, and the source emphasizes it remains a huge priority. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, Meta, IBM, OpenAI with RLHF, Google DeepMind's ethics team, Anthropic building ethics in from the start. It's a constant effort to make these powerful tools safer, fairer, and more controllable as they become more embedded in society.
It's good to hear that focus remains strong. Now, the gradient flow source threw in a bit of a reality check, didn't it? Comparing AI hype to other fields.
Yeah, a useful bit of perspective. They pointed out how slow progress has sometimes been in areas like robotics or full automation, despite decades of work. They use the self-driving car analogy, Tesla's ambitious timelines versus Waymo's slower, steadier approach.
So the takeaway being, maybe temper expectations
Right.
slightly.
Kind of. Just a reminder that while generative AI is incredibly promising, especially for automation over the next decade, history suggests big technological shifts can take longer and hit more bumps than the initial hype suggests. A little caution amidst the excitement.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. We've traced this incredible journey, starting with GPT-3 in 2020, which really demonstrated the power of scale and this idea of in-context learning, but was also upfront about challenges like bias.
Then we saw GPT-4 in 2023 push the boundaries again, especially with multimodality, vision, and crucially, integrating a much more serious, proactive focus on safety and mitigation before launch, even if those efforts weren't perfect. A sign of the field maturing, perhaps.
And that brings us to mid-2025, a landscape defined by fierce competition, especially on price for basic API access. Constant iteration with newer models like the O-series targeting specific tasks like web research, and really importantly, seeing these models move firmly into practical business applications through orchestration platforms.
Right. And the research continues pushing towards deeper reasoning, broader multimodality, and that essential ongoing work on ethics, safety, and control. The focus is shifting maybe from just raw power to making these tools truly useful, reliable, and safe in the real world.
It's just an astonishing pace of development over only 5 years.
Mm.
And thinking about how quickly these models went from research papers to being embedded in tools we might use every day, well, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What does this rapid evolution mean for you, the listener? How do we all keep up, stay informed, and learn to critically engage with these incredibly powerful tools as they become even more woven into the fabric of our lives? Definitely something to chew on.
A very important question indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.